Thank you, Dr. Kim, for your stimulating lecture. My name is Daniel Lee, and I serve as the Academic Dean of the Center for Asian American Theology and Ministry and the Assistant Professor of Theology and Asian American Ministry. I especially appreciated your framing of our topic at hand about Asian American Christianity with a solid historical backdrop of Asian American exclusion. The idea of California being a progressive, reliably blue state is relatively recent. Here in the city of Pasadena, this exclusion or literal erasure of Asian Americans was blatantly displayed on November 6, 1885, during what is now remembered as a Night of Terror. About a quarter of Pasadena's population at that time burned down Pasadena's Chinatown and kicked out about 100 Chinese immigrants. This egregious act was a coordinated effort between the underclass and the city elites, which included a member of the clergy. And thereafter, the city officials drafted its first racially restrictive zoning ordinance that was not challenged until 1950s. And if you're local and curious, this Chinatown is located around Mill Street, which is ironically behind the popular Taiwanese bakery 85 Degrees on Fair Oaks Avenue. It's important for us to remember that the ethno-racial demographic of the US is the work of the US government. The reason why only 6% of the US population is Asian American is that immigrants from Asia were rejected for so long. When your history is erased and you're continually called a foreigner, you believe that you have no roots here. Also, you always believe that you are the first, the trailblazer, not because they weren't giants who went before you, but because you don't know your history and you do not know that you have generations of elders who have led the way. So with my gratitude to Dr. Kim for her lecture's historical grounding, I would like to offer up 3 reflections for us to consider together. First, I wonder if our present discussion would benefit from including the Asian American mainline Protestants beyond the more recent evangelicalism. Many Asian American evangelicals do not know about the trailblazing leadership of Japanese American Nisei pastors, such as United Methodist Bishop Roy Sano or the American Baptist pastor Paul Nagano. Both these leaders were profoundly impacted by the burgeoning Asian American movement of the 70s and were the first to develop Asian American theology that was self-aware as Asian American. These church leaders founded influential and groundbreaking organizations like Pacific Asian American Center for Theology and Strategies, called PAX for short, at GTU, and Japanese Evangelical Missionary Society, GEMS, and Asian American Baptist Caucus, and the Council for Asian Pacific Theology. Their influence as theological and church leaders went beyond the Asian American community to their broader ecclesial communities. And they were doing this 50 years ago. Along with them, there were other Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, Filipino American pastors as well, who were socially and contextually aware. Among the influential Asian American mainline Christian leaders of our time, Japanese American Presbyterian Frank Yamada serves as the executive director of ATS, or the Association of Theological Schools, an accrediting body that supports and guides 270 graduate schools and seminaries in the US and Canada, including Fuller, Talbot School of Theology at Biola University, and Azusa Pacific Seminary around this area. Before this role, Dr. Yamada was one of the first Asian American seminary presidents, leading McCormick Seminary in Chicago, increasing the diversity of the student body during his tenure. If we were to include Asian American Roman Catholic leaders, we must raise the extraordinary career of the Vietnamese American theologian Peter Phan and his influence upon Asian American theology, as well as the theology of migration, ecumenics, religious dialogue, and Catholic theology in general, with so many other topics. I mean, the man has 3 doctorates, as well as a great sense of humor. As evangelicalism is in a state of turmoil, it is especially imperative that Asian American evangelicals recover and learn from the longer history of Asian American Christianity and the giants that have come before us, as well as other influential Asian American Christians, profoundly shaping the wider Christian landscape. The previous boundaries about shared confessional convictions and theological positions are becoming problematic. When some of our own evangelicals are promoting racism and xenophobia. In terms of the work of justice and culture engagement, Asian American mainline Christian leaders have been at it so much longer than Asian American evangelicals. They have a legacy of 50 years and counting. I believe this is a legacy for all Asian American Christians, regardless of confessional affiliation. My second reflection is about the terminology of Asianizing. I understand this term as a shorthand of sorts to cover the complexity and diversity of what Asian American Christianity looks like. However, given that main way Asian Americans experience racism is through the trope of forever foreigner or perpetual foreigner, never accepted as true American, I wonder if another word should be used. Also, the Orientalism deeply ingrained in the dominant representation of Asian Americans make it difficult to imagine Asia in its dynamic living complexity. So much more than the reduced stereotypes available to us in the popular imagination. White American Christianity, as well as Asian Americans and other people of color who have been tutored under it, generally suffer under the same Orientalism, focusing on the cultural and ethnic differences of Asian Americans as their key distinguishing feature, blind to the racist gaze that often essentialize and pathologize Asianness. Obviously, since we're talking about Asian American Christianity and not Asian Christianity, there should be a significant distinction of this particular context, of Asian American context, even though there cannot be and should not be a hard separation between Asia and Asian America. Even when Asians immigrate to the US with their Christianity, their version of faith becomes a different thing within this new context as a racial minority. Indeed, the interdisciplinary scholar Lisa Lowe describes Asian America as being defined by its heterogeneity, hybridity, and multiplicity. In that vein, the question is, how do we describe Asian American Christianity in its heterogeneity, hybridity, and multiplicity, and not just focus on what sounds like a cultural element from Asia? The reason I belabor this point is that in my research and teaching experience, I found that Asian Americans in general lack the contextual literacy to accurately and precisely describe their experience and articulate their identity and locate themselves. This linguistic and conceptual inadequacy is especially apparent regarding race, racism, and racialization. This should not be surprising, seeing as how evangelical theology, with its history of missiology, has felt a lot more comfortable with ethnicity and culture and mostly avoided or marginalized race, although that is actually changing of late. Without being trained on race, especially from an Asian American perspective, Asian American Christians would not know the true nature of the racial marginality that they experience, its deep historical and structural roots. Therefore, they will act out of colonized mentality or internalized racism, seeing success as coming from complicity with white hegemony. I've been thinking about the idea of Asian Americans being the bridge, and I wonder if that can be simply a reframing of the racist model minority myth, casting Asian Americans as peaceful and safe minorities who don't cause problems by questioning the structures of injustice. If we're bridging Blacks and whites, are Asian Americans trying to bring about reconciliation when there should be instead demands for justice? Or maybe if a bridge between generations, between the immigrant generation and the American-born generation, for example, are Asian Americans failing to see the toxic Orientalism that obscures our assessment of what we understand to be cultural differences between the generations. Our bicultural and racial competence is far too often implicit and inarticulate, assumed, when in fact we've barely even begun the difficult work of equipping ourselves after decades of white normative education that have erased Asian Americans in our over 170 years of history. The last reflection is more of a reminder, something to keep in mind. In my role as the academic dean of Fuller's Center for Asian American Theology and Ministry, whenever I am speaking in front of an audience about Asian America, I remind everyone that while Korean Americans are around 35% of the Asian American evangelical population and significantly more in seminaries, within the overall Asian American Christian population, which includes mainline Protestants and Roman Catholics, we're only a little over 20%. And in the general Asian American populations, Korean Americans are less than 10% after Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, Indian Americans, and Vietnamese Americans. In the study of intersectionality, what researchers observed is that within minority groups, whoever is the most privileged end up monopolizing the label, marginalizing those who are double or triple minorities. In a classic study from 1989, legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw notes that Black men often define Black people, while white women represent all women. Black women, representing neither of the categories, are thus often overlooked when policies are set to affect Black people or women. A similar dynamic happens within Asian American, often represented by East Asian Americans, or in Christian circles by Korean Americans. If you're male and middle class or above, that helps even more as well. This does not take away anything from Dr. Kim's observations about the rise of Asian American Christian leaders into prominent positions within the evangelical world, which is quite impressive and impactful. As a Korean American myself, I'm excited about these developments. However, this problematic trend toward East Asian American or Korean American ethnic monopolizing, or some have even called it East Asian American or Korean American supremacy or colonization, should give us a caution of what we mean when we talk about Asian America and Asian Americans. Who are referring to, who are we including or excluding? Whenever we say Asian Americans, we need to remember that we're not just talking about Korean Americans. Otherwise, the act of highlighting a minority voice ends up being oppressive to people within that group. With these reflections, I want to once again express my appreciation for Dr. Kim's lecture. Thank you.